Okay, the last video we talked about guide tones, which I just played. Third and seventh. Third, seventh. You can continue to think about these guide tones, but you want to be able to put that into a context of creating line forms. So a line form is, let's say we have one chord here. We want to have rhythmic variation, of course, and we want to have some chromaticism in that to make it interesting, spice it up. So on this guide tone here, we just have a small, how shall I put it, a small line here. It's nothing spectacular. We went to that, we can go to that. So what I'm doing is creating a small line, but using the guide tone to change to the next chord, to imply the next chord. And you can keep the line form short and sweet here. So you're really only using, that's the guide tone. I'm using 3 notes in addition to the guide tone. And then I just change the guide tone to accommodate the next chord. Keep that same line form, 3 notes. Same thing again. Maybe a little bit of a rhythmic variation. Then back to the same thing. And then when we go to the 2 and 5, you can actually use the same line form. It's so simple. However, having said that, we want to be a little bit more mature, advanced in our ideas of line forms, and so that means we have to break down each chord and think of something that we could play that would last through the number of measures that we're going to play over, and then insert that into the chord progression. Of course, one thing to say before I go to do that is the chromaticism involved. So let's say I took that little simple line form. Okay, if I want to put something chromatic in there, here's what you want to think of. You have that chord tone on the strong beat, and then we have a root, flat 7, 5, flat 7. All of those are chord tones from the B flat 7 chord. If I were going to go, before I played the target tone, which is basically the essential chord tone. So if I played a half step above, and then a half step below, and then went into that, that would be a little chromatic thing that we added. See? And if we were to do this second one, on this second chord tone, which turns out to be the inversion, it becomes the flat 7 actually of the next chord. When I play this phrase, the thing that you want to keep in mind here is that when you're adding chromatic tones to the target tone, the guide tone, there's such a thing as called neighboring tones, and the way that works is that you can approach the target from a half step below or a half step above, but if there is a chord tone involved, or scale tone actually, from the scale source, the parental scale source from which you are creating your line. For example, this is a B flat 7. So we have those notes as our scale source. And when I played the 4th note, or actually, if you want to call it the 11, but it's 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I played the flat 3rd, which is here. which is not in the scale, neither, which is the equivalent of a half-step chromatic note, and then to the guide tone, target tone. So okay, I would have played that a little bit sooner if I'm playing really in tempo there, but the thing to keep in mind is that you have a scale tone that is also available to you, which is a neighboring tone, as they call it, as well as the half-step chromatic note. And the way to know whether that's going to work or not is to think of it in the context of the chord you're on. So when I went to this chord and went, the scale there, even though all of these chords and these first two chords, I mean, are dominants, I'm thinking only of an unaltered dominant scale. So if I'm on B flat, I'm thinking of the B flat dominant scale, which is called the Mixolydian mode. And I'm still thinking of that when I'm going to this. Even though this chord could be a 5 chord in another key, all dominant chords can be a 5 chord in either a major or minor. We do have a dominant chord, which is the 4 chord if you're in melodic minor, but we'll save that for another day. So when we go to this second chord here, you have to think of the scale source. So you'll notice that these 3 notes are in the scale. Okay? So I get to use those. When I analyze it though, this note is the root of the of our E flat 7. And then here, that right there is the 6th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then back to, and then into the flat 7. Now that flat 7 in this chord is one of the guide tones. One thing that defines the chord, the quality of the chord. And you'll notice that the movement from here is again these 2 notes here, going here to here, half step apart, and going from here, that's a half step. So in each case we're moving the least amount of distance possible within that scale and within that chord, the chord tones. Hope that makes sense to you. So when we're playing this line, and we add the chromaticism, we have an addition of chromaticism there. Very simple chromaticism added to our 3-note line. Okay, so that's a very, very simplistic way of looking at it. But you do want to know the quality of the chord you're on. So in a blues progression, which is what we're using here, you have also have a secondary dominant, like I said before, which is the G7. And whenever you have secondary dominant, you can have an altered chord tone. Now in this case, we can add any of the 4 possibilities for an alteration. Meaning this, that in a G7 chord or any dominant chord, the natural scale tones, just like in the B flat and the E flat, same scale formula, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. We also have 4 other notes here. Okay, so for example, if we had the scale and went the first note and the second note, and then we moved the second note up to an octave, we call that the 9th. Okay, if we move it up another octave, it's called the 9th. So we can have a G9. Now, you're probably familiar with this, or so that chord there that I'm playing here, you don't want to get too theoretical on all of this right now. That's a B minor 7 flat 5, technically, but adding a G to the bottom of that creates another chord, keeps the dominant ninth, a G9 chord, dominant ninth chord. So in that case, we would add that note. That'd be a natural tension. There's nothing really outside the key in that note. The other one is the fourth, or the 11, if you want to call it that. And then you could have something of this nature. A little dissonant sounding there, because that note is the fourth. Up here we're calling it the 11th because I'm adding the third. So I have a root, flat 7, a third, and then I'm adding this fourth, which we'll call the add 11. Okay, and if you played it down here, I guess you would hear this. You'd hear the suspended fourth is what you would hear. If you temporarily do a setup where you're adding it and then releasing it. So the third is not there at first, it's the fourth, and then it's to that. But the quality of the chord does not change in that regard. It just sets up a little bit more of a tension. The sixth note, the 6th degree, that right there is in the upper octave, is the 13th. So we would have a G13, a dominant 13. And I really like that chord, personally. A lot of us like that. So that chord contains all natural tensions up to this point. But like I said, this is functioning as a secondary dominant, because if we're using B flat as our root of our beginning chord progression, then the G goes down to the sixth note, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, G, and then instead of playing a minor chord, we would play a dominant. But it can have the natural, it won't sound good with the natural tensions. The other chords sound good with the natural tensions, but when you go to a secondary dominant, as I was saying, this becomes better sounding if you're creating line forms, if you would use one of the alterations. And so one of the alterations are, and there can only be 4. Now we can call them different things. For example, if you had the 13 here, and we lower the 13 down here, we could technically, you know, we're writing this out, we could call this a G7 flat 13. Ooh. But it's there's another simpler way of looking at it, and that is if you have the essential chord tones, the G, we have the flat 7 here, which is the F, the B, the third, and then the D in the normal chord. If we had that note raised up, which is the same thing as flatting it from here, this is a G7 sharp 5, or an augmented. Okay, augmented dominant. I think it's a simpler way of looking at things. And likewise, if we were to take this note, which is on top as a D, and lower it a half step, D flat, now we have a G7 flat 5 chord. Okay. Now that gets us into some tritone sounds, but I'm going to save that for just a moment because I don't want to confuse you. We're only talking about the 4 alterations. So the G7 flat 5 there. So on the top note here we have a G. We have the 9. We go back to that 9. If we flatten the 9, lower it, then we have a G7 flat 9. If we have the G in the bass. Okay, but you'll notice that without the G, this chord is diminished. And just as a side note, which we won't dwell on right now, but you can move these notes, a minor third, in any direction, horizontally, and you will have another inversion of the diminished. Now, if you're going to think of it as a dominant chord, then you want to think of the flat 9 that's on top as really being the guide tone for your substitution of your dominant chord. We'll talk more about this in the diminished section. But here we have the dominant 7th flat 9. Up here we have the flat 9, G7 flat 9. Now, the dominant 7th flat 9 is a natural occurring chord in harmonic minor. So if you're in harmonic minor, let's say you're in C harmonic minor, and I was playing the first chord, it's a minor major 7, adding the 9th on top. That's the 1 chord in harmonic minor. The 5 chord in harmonic minor, if you harmonize the chords, is a G7 flat 9. Okay, so that leaves us one other chord, and that is the sharp 9. And the sharp 9 is just, you're raising up that's an A note, so you raise it up to A sharp. Now if you take a look at this and you go, this note right here that I just played is the flat 9 of the G7. If I go here and play the sharp 9, that note's not in the harmonic minor scale. So if you're playing a harmonic minor scale, you have a natural flat 9. If you're playing the C melodic minor scale, you'd have a G7 sharp 9. So yeah, know that those two chords extensions come from different scale sources. So really think about this. You only have 3 when you're dealing with this. You have the natural, okay, that's your natural Mixolydian, which is the 5th chord or the 5th mode of major, whatever. Just think of it as a dominant scale. And then if you're thinking of this 5 chord being a flat 9 chord, then you're automatically into the harmonic minor. And if you're playing the sharp 9, you're temporarily in melodic minor. And in jazz in general, these two minor scales are usually mixed around. Okay? They're mixed around when you're playing, creating lines. Either one of them would fit, as long as you know that you're not going to fall on a strong beat when you're playing something that clashes. When I clash, I don't mean that it doesn't sound outside. What I mean is it doesn't clash in the sense that it's so obviously placed wrongly that you know oh, that's not going to work. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to think of the secondary dominant chord as being a temporary flat 9, even if we don't use the flat 9 chord. Okay, the flat 9 tone, or the chord, I should say, yes, in our rhythm section on the progression. One other thing, you can have another, what we call auxiliary scales. These are scales that are created by harmonizing in instead of harmonizing in thirds. This one is harmonized in whole steps. So if we had a G7 chord and we really wanted to sound outside, we could use the whole tone scale. That's nothing but whole steps. You're just playing. And if you move up an entire octave in whole steps, you end up right where you began. Now there is a triad or a chord that's attached to this, and that would be the Augmented Triad, and that moves in whole steps. Okay, so there's a lot of options there that you could use to create a line form over that particular chord. And remember, anytime you have a 2 to a 5 chord, which in this case we do, whether we're playing in a regular standard jazz tune or playing in a blues, jazz blues, which goes 2-5, then you could still think of the dominant chord as being more important than, say, the minor there. So in this case, getting back to the secondary dominant, what we're going to alter, I suggest something like, say, diminished arpeggio, perhaps. So if I was playing a diminished arpeggio, I would either start this diminished arpeggio not on the root, but on the flat 9, or maybe the 3rd, or the flat 7, but none on the root. It won't sound good. So if we had this, see? Going into this next note here. So basically, you've got a lot of different things you can use there. I suggested the diminished arpeggio because it's quick, and I think when it comes to rhythmic variation here, we could do that as well. We could think of triplets. We didn't talk about triplets, but that would be good, you know. There's a triplet, just working off the scale, and then here. So simple. And then on that, over there, you could use a triplet there, you know. It doesn't have to be all, you don't have to play all quarter note, I mean, you don't have to play all eighth notes or all triplets. You should be able to mix it up, you know, and you can also hold notes over, you know, dot, you know, like. You can use notes like that, you know. You know, staggered notes. Use lots of rhythmic variations there for what you could do to create a line form. So okay, so let's take what we just did there, let's move it up a notch, and let's go to the section where we're going to deal with each chord, creating line forms for each chord. Now sometimes you can think of a lick as being a line form, but in order to use the lick as a part of your line, you want to make sure that it's movable to any chord you want. You may have to change major and minor tonalities to make it happen, but you want to be able to do a form that makes sense, and not just something that you repeat over and over again. That kind of thing. That's just a lick. And sure, it works over, you could play it over, on a blues you could play it over every one of those chords. But you don't want to do that forever. You want to create something that makes a melodic line, and it makes sense, and then it connects right at the proper point. So let's get on with it. Let's go to that section, okay? Alright, see you there.